Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
It's a compulsive behavior that takes on a shape where the person at some point fantasizes so strongly and cannot focus on anything else anymore. So they are basically consumed now by their thoughts, and they want to engage in the behavior, and they are in that moment not considering consequences. Think of an individual with a severe drug addiction. They behave in a similar fashion. They may have been incarcerated and you let them out, and a few months later they commit the same offense. So this is a compulsive behavior, and I believe in that sense quite similar to an addictive behavior.
What turned me on about the children, the young teenage girls that I was chatting with online was their innocence, and the idea that what I was doing with them, talking sexually with them, was taboo to society, I guess, and it excited me.
You know what I was making my Barbie dolls do? How awful is that you have a young child that is playing with Barbie dolls and she's making her Barbie dolls have sex because that's what she's learned.
I was a very successful teacher, very successful coach, beyond reason. I found a niche, my way to win. So I hung around and they invited me to take a team, which I did. And I met this one kid, my victim.
Hello, I'm Tina Stanford, Director of the New York State Office of Victim Services. On behalf of the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this very important presentation. As a former prosecutor and crime victim advocate who has dealt with sex offenders and seen the impact of their crimes on their victims, none of what we've just heard surprises me. As a parent, though, it sickens and scares me. Although we all worry about the stranger who may abduct and molest our child, statistically it is far, far more likely that the threat to your child comes from someone you or your child knows, a relative, a friend, a coach, a teacher, a clergyman, someone you and your child know and trust, and that threat is very real. The FBI estimates that about 25% of all children, 1 in 5 boys and 1 in 3 girls, will fall victim to a sexual predator. Pedophiles and other sex offenders are extraordinarily resourceful, manipulative, and exploitive. You may have no idea that the adult showering your child with attention and seemingly innocent affection is in fact the child molester until it is too late. But you can put the odds in your favor and in your child's favor by understanding how child molesters operate and recognizing the signs that may indicate your child is at risk or has already been abused. The New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services created this video to provide you, a parent, with the information you need to protect your child. Over the course of this presentation, you'll be introduced to 4 paroled sex offenders. All the names are pseudonyms. Pete, a respected member of his community, began viewing kiddie porn in the dead of night and chatting online with young girls, trying to engage them in sexual fantasies. He molested his 10 and 11-year-old nieces when they stayed at his house. When they told their parents, the parents believed Uncle Pete, not their own children. Pete ultimately got caught when he enticed who he thought was a 12-year-old girl, but was really an undercover police officer in an online fantasy, and confessed. David was a child therapist who specialized in treating children who had been the victim of sexual abuse. He molested 3 young boys and 2 girls, typically in his office and occasionally while their parents were waiting in the waiting room. He kept them quiet by threatening to divulge their secrets and confidences if they disclosed his. Fred used his role as a teacher and coach to gain access to his victims. He focused on emotionally needy boys and sexually exploited their need for adult affection. Fred was 72 years old and had been an active pedophile most of his life when he got convicted of having oral sex with an 11-year-old boy he met at the elementary school where he volunteered as a coach. Jack molested both his 13-year-old stepdaughter and 8-year-old stepson. The girl told her mother, who didn't believe her. Jack told the boy that if he said anything, the police would come and the child would be taken away from his mother. We'll also hear from 3 victims. Lori, who was repeatedly molested when she was 6 or 7 years old by a teenage neighbor. It was years before she told her mother, and decades before she recognized that what this boy had done to her was a crime. Jessica, who was abused by her own father. But it was Jessica, not her father, who was banished from the household. Jessica's mother chose to believe her husband, not her daughter, and to this day refuses to watch her husband's videotaped confession. Jessica has a history of cutting herself. And Mark, who suffered abuse by a priest starting when he was 12 years old. The priest lavished Mark and other boys with praise and attention and brought them on special trips to his hunting cabin deep in the wilderness, where the boys were served alcohol and abused over many years. In order to understand child molesters, we first need to make a distinction between the 2 general types, situational child molesters and preferential child molesters. Situational molesters would molest a child for, well, convenience. They would generally prefer an adult, but the child is available and vulnerable. The second type, the classic pedophile, an individual with a sexual preference for children. In either case, the molester is most likely to be a male, although there certainly are women who sexually abuse children as well.
If I could categorize the characteristics of certain kids, that would be a turn on, if you will, for me. It would be primarily boys from puberty on to adulthood. And for me, the attraction would be like for a darker complected, physically fit or athletic teen, especially who was outgoing or defiant, spoke his mind, assertive.
I was able to control it, but after all, it was my sexual outlet, my only sexual outlet. I'm not trying to make an excuse for it. It was appalling. But on the other hand, that's all I had. And so it was that or nothing. And a great deal of the time, nothing was okay. But occasionally, a situation would come up and first, emotional attraction, feeling sorry for the boy, and then the comforting, and then the sex.
Pedophiles are masterful manipulators, and they often follow a familiar script or pattern. They zero in on a child, quickly figure out his or her vulnerabilities, and then exploit that weakness.
If a person is a preferential pedophile, they typically create situations that provide access. So, for example, you find these individuals quite often among professions that involve children. This could be a teacher or a coach. It could be a clergy person. It could be a doctor who interacts with children.
People who are going to molest children, it's a script. It's a ritual for them. They pinpoint a certain person, figure out what their weakness is or what they'll respond to. For me, it was telling me that I was extremely responsible and being the best altar boy or being one of the best students at the school made me feel good, and I wanted to not disappoint him or things like that.
And I got involved in activities where children, boys of my age, were involved. And I became good at what I did in those fields. Coaching junior football, junior basketball, and so on. And it wasn't usually the athletes, it was the wannabes, the hang-arounds. The athletes, they were self-sufficient usually. They had to have some guts in order to turn out for a team and play. But the people, the kids that hung around and wanted to be the lonely ones and so on, I would make friends with and so on.
Even though I worked with high-risk kids, many of whom had been sexually abused, all who have had different emotional and behavioral problems. As someone who began sexually offending against children, there were certain, I guess, traits, characteristics that I would look for or would help me decide who was potentially, in my mind, willing to go along with my sexual advances.
I was scared because we were alone in the cabin, and my heart was pounding, I remember, and he was telling me to sleep in his bed. He told me that he'd just gotten back from Thailand and he learned a new massage technique, and he had me stripped down and in the guise of a massage started to molest me. I remember saying to myself, I hope my dad never finds out about this. He would be upset with me for doing that, which is classic, blaming myself. And after it was over, I remember staying, it was the middle of winter, we were in the middle of the woods, no way to get out of there. I remember staying up the whole night, fearing that this would continue.
Sex offenders not only con their victims, they con themselves, and through massive rationalization, convince themselves that there is nothing wrong with their behavior, that they are simply responding to a child's need for attention or affection, or that they are educating the child about sex.
I didn't feel I was harming them by having sexual fantasies with them online. I wasn't really harming them physically, so it's okay if I go there, and if I meet him, I might harm him physically, and I didn't want that to happen. And in my mind, I thought, well, if he's not stopping it, he's not protesting, part of my grooming was to say things like, we don't have to keep doing this if you don't want to, or do you want to do something else? And that was my MO, that was my theme that I would use later on. By doing that, that was my justification, my rationalization, my twisted thinking to allow myself to live with myself.
What I learned that a child needs to be in good emotional health. And I provided that naturally, but it was a way of grooming. I was kind to him. I was gentle, understanding, I was empathetic. In other words, I supplied what he didn't get at home. A pseudo-parent.
There are a lot of children who are needy for attention and affection. And that does not necessarily mean that these are children from bad parents. I would say if a person then claims that they would not approach a child sexually anymore if that child just received enough attention and affection in his or her own home, I think this is just a terrible rationalization.
Experts tell us that pornography plays a major role in pedophilia. Pedophiles almost always collect pornography and trade it with others. It's an obsession.
The role of pornography is really critical in the development of my sexual offending behavior. And in reality, it was providing fuel for the fire by over and over and over again, looking at and masturbating to deviant images of adults with children or teens and younger children. And over time, I began to slowly admit to myself that this was an addiction, that it was increasingly out of my control. When my pornography addiction began to include child porn, that was the bottom line. That was the last ignition to start this fire towards sexual offending.
Most pedophiles start out by grooming the child or worming their way into the child's heart and life, oftentimes through you, the parent. They will ply the child with attention and gifts, become a friend and confidant, and once they've established a bond of trust, slowly and methodically begin initiating sexual conduct. It may start off with a pat on the fanny, or what might at first glance appear to be an innocent embrace, nothing that would necessarily alert you or the child to his sinister motives.
After a while, he probably will try to engage in some physical contact, and that is of course intensely sexually arousing to him. So for example, he may put his arm around the child's shoulder and then after a while let the hand wander down to the child's buttocks and things of that kind. And so little by little then the behavior becomes sexualized.
I started wooing her by becoming a part of the family and taking her to amusement parks, to movie theaters. I would put my arm around her shoulder and then just to see where I could go, I would eventually I moved my hand down towards her breast and I had placed my hand on her breast. From there it proceeded to when she was sleeping at night in the privacy of our home, I would go into her bedroom with her mother in the house and proceed to molest her in her sleep by touching her breast, eventually moving my hand down her belly to her vagina and touching her vagina. I had proceeded a year later, approximately a year and a half, maybe 2 years later, to do the same thing to my 8-year-old stepson at the time.
Child molesters use a number of tricks to keep kids quiet and discourage them from disclosing the abuse to a parent or law enforcement authorities. Sometimes it's a threat of physical harm. Sometimes it is the threat of embarrassment. Sometimes they play on the child's sympathies, telling the child that if they say anything, the offender will go to jail. Many of them will essentially blackmail the child, getting the child to do something they know is wrong, such as viewing pornography or drink alcohol, and use that as leverage. Often, they will tell the child that no one will believe them anyway, and often, as we will see shortly, they are right.
One boy said that he was experimenting sexually with a neighbor girl. They were both about 10, 9 at the time. And rather than doing what I should have done, which was to report this to the parents and work through it effectively, in my mind, as an offender, I'm storing this information to say, well, when I begin to sexually offend against him, now I have this little thing in the back of my pocket.
I told my victim, I said, look, we could get in trouble doing this, both of us, both you and me. And he asked me, what would you do if I told on you? And I told him that I would be disappointed in him. That's all. I don't threaten. There's never intimidation, bullying, forcible compulsion, nothing. It was all manipulation.
Only about 1/3 of the children who are sexually abused will report the crime, and then an average of 15 years after the abuse occurred. Sometimes they are embarrassed or scared and fear that their parents will be angry with them, or that if they tell anyone, they will break up the family. Oftentimes they feel a loyalty to the abuser, who may be your husband or boyfriend, a beloved relative or a cherished friend, someone who has been kind and generous to them. Because children are so reluctant to come forward, pedophiles frequently victimize dozens, even hundreds of kids before they are caught and stopped.
When I finally did disclose this information to my parents, my mother, I didn't get any help. She kind of swept it under the rug and it wasn't talked about. It taught me not to trust adults, but that basically just ruined my trust in my mother and my father and relationships with adults and authority figures.
I was scared and I didn't know what would happen if I told. I didn't even tell anyone what was going on during that span of time. I was scared more than anything, and my dad's a lot bigger than me, and I was afraid of what would happen. I mean, he had made comments about if I had told, no one would believe me, sort of thing, because my dad was in the fire department and stuff like that, and he was very well known to the community.
I was trying to minimize what happened to me because I didn't want to be a molestation victim. I didn't want to be perceived as having sexual encounters with the priest, or any male for that matter. And to this day, I feel very guilty that I didn't speak up at the time, and it would have prevented these younger students from getting molested.
It is not easy for a child to come forward and tell you that they have been sexually abused, especially if the abuser is someone you know, trust, or even love. Unfortunately, all too often, children who do come forward are not believed. Take Jessica, for example. Jessica told us that she had been abused by her father for years. The first time she told authorities and her mother, nobody believed her, and the abuse continued for 4 more years. Then police interrogated her father and obtained a videotaped confession, but he was home in 4 months. It was around that time that Jessica started cutting herself.
So I just started cutting. I don't even know how, where the idea came from. But each time I cut, I got a sense that, I'm actually alive, and that, the pain from the cutting was nothing compared to how I felt with my dad and how betrayed I felt with my parents. I was just doing that to feel like I was alive. I had a suicide attempt because I just couldn't deal with what was going on. My mom had abandoned me. I had barely any contact with my sister, and my dad was a crappy person. So I just thought the best way out would be to end it, but the cutting was just as a stress relief, as a way to make me, it made me feel like I had control over something, because my whole life was spinning out of control.
Unfortunately, Jessica's experience is not at all unusual. When confronted with the possibility that someone they loved, trusted, or are married to molested their child, many parents go into denial and refuse to believe the allegations, which of course leaves the abuser free to continue abusing the child.
I was shocked. I was really shocked. I found that hard to understand, why they didn't believe their own daughter. But they seemed to believe me. Or if they didn't believe me, they just wanted to fluff it up and shove it out of the way, and we'll just move on at that point. I think deep down inside, they may have known there was a possibility that I molested my niece, and they may not have wanted to face up to that.
I believe in the beginning, I believe honestly in the beginning she didn't believe her daughter at all. I believed that she thought her daughter was trying to break the marriage up.
Children are very, very loyal to their parents. So when the abuser is a parent or step-parent, the child is often tormented with conflicting emotions and loyalties, as is the innocent spouse. The spouse is also very loyal to her husband. Sometimes he has convinced her that the abuse never really happened, or that it was a momentary lapse in judgment and will never happen again. Sometimes she fears losing her provider. I should point out that she has something else to fear as well, a criminal prosecution. A parent who knowingly exposes a child to a sex offender can be charged with endangering the welfare of a child.
I I do feel a sense of loyalty and love for him. He may have been a crappy parent, but it didn't matter. And, you know, I wish I could, there are times where I wish I could, you know, call him up and say, hey, Dad, guess what? I got 100 on a test. But, you know, I can't, you know, because I hate him yet love him all at the same time. I love him for who he was, but I hate him for what he had become.
I think when a child talks about having been molested, particularly when the molester is within the same family, assume it is the father or stepfather that has molested the child, and the child talks to the mother. The mother in that moment is placed in an extremely difficult situation, because the situation now is that she is going to lose the husband as well. Secondly, the mother may have observed certain things and may have looked the other way. And so she's now confronted with the truth, and she would have to admit that she actually did not follow her intuition and let it happen. And so she would have to assume part of the blame.
I think the closure for me would be if he stood up and apologized to me and said, you know, I did do this and I'm sorry for it. That's sort of the closure I need, but I need my mom's closure. I need closure for my mom more than anything. I need her to say, you know, I'm sorry for sticking up next to your dad while I should have been a parent. And, you know, that's what I need. I mean, I think my dad had hurt me, but I believe my mom had hurt me more.
The internet has opened an entirely new frontier for child molesters, providing them with unfettered access to children. They will troll the online sites frequented by children, such as chat rooms, online gaming, music sharing, and social networking sites like MySpace and Facebook.
I try to entice young teen girls to chat room in the chat rooms by I would go to a teen-related chat room, and I would find one and I would start chatting with her. And if she was receptive to me and not ran, I would keep chatting with her, usually just normal, everyday things, talk about, until after a while I would start moving towards sexual feelings and things like that, or even sexual fantasies sometimes if they're really receptive.
FBI Special Agent David Fallon has been investigating online sexual predators for more than 10 years, and sometimes will pose as a teenage girl entering a chat room. We thought it would be interesting to watch him work and see what develops when he goes into a chat room pretending to be a 15-year-old girl. Special Agent Fallon does not engage anyone in the chat room. He merely enters as a young girl and waits. He does not have to wait long before being approached by a predator.
I'm in this particular chat room as a 15-year-old teenage girl. Within 30 seconds, I've been contacted on an instant message program to chat with what looks like a 47-year-old male from Cape Cod. I've also been contacted by another individual, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, and I will attempt to engage him in an instant message conversation. And now I have another one as well. So that's 3 within probably a minute and a half. The second individual has told me that he's 28 years old from South Carolina and that his name is Scott. The third individual, Superhero 129, has told us that he's a male, 47 years old from Florida. I'm going to tell him that I'm 15 years old, a female from Albany, New York. Superhero 129 asks if I like guys older than myself. I responded that I do, and he's asking what has been the oldest person that I've been with. Then the conversation may turn more sexual because that's why they're in this particular chat room. He sent me the picture of himself with the big muscle pose, and I'm trying to do a little flattery. I said, oh, you're huge, you must work out a ton. I'm telling him my dad does too, just to show him that he's still talking to a 15-year-old girl. He responds, I would not think a pretty young girl like you would like an older guy like me. But I do. Superhero 129 is asking if I saw him somewhere, would I flirt with him? I asked Superhero 129 what he would say to me if he saw me out on the street someplace, and he'd tell me that I'm a pretty girl. I'm asking what else he would say. And there he goes. He says, would you fool around with me?
Within 30 minutes, Agent Fallon, posing as a 15-year-old girl on a Monday morning, was contacted by 7 individuals between the ages of 28 and 55. 2 of these individuals sent pictures, and one of them accessed the MySpace page Agent Fallon set up for the fictitious girl, and then made a sexual solicitation, again, all within a half hour. When we were children, our parents taught us to never talk to strangers. That's still good advice. But today, the dangerous stranger may be lurking on a computer screen in your family room. The healing process can begin only when the victim comes to understand that what happened to them was wrong, that it was not their fault, that it was a crime. That is, unfortunately, a lot harder than you might think. Some are never able to come to terms with it. For others, it can take decades.
When I told my mother when I was 12 what had happened, I didn't feel it was a crime. I felt at that time like I had done something terribly, terribly wrong by letting this stuff happen to me. I just didn't view it as a crime because it wasn't violent, it wasn't hurtful, and who did he hurt? He didn't hurt anybody. He didn't hurt anybody.
And I remember being shocked when the news broke that he was molesting children. And my mom called to tell me, did that happen to you? And I said, yes. She broke down in tears and you know, was very upset and crying. And I was shocked by that. That's how my mindset was. I was shocked that she was upset. And that was a real eye-opener to me, that what had happened was wrong and worthy of talking about and standing up and saying that was wrong. It wasn't until that time that I felt that I didn't have the right to speak out. About 32 years old.
Obviously, we all want to shield our children from abuse and prevent them from ever being victimized. Prevention is, of course, the goal, but we know all too well that children, including children in loving, stable homes with caring and responsible parents, can fall victim to sexual predators. So we should all be aware of some of the warning signs that may be an indication that your child is being abused. These include a sudden fear or dislike of certain people, withdrawal from friends, family, and activities, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, discipline problems, displaying a knowledge of sex that is not age appropriate, and drug or alcohol abuse. Of course, all these troubling behaviors could result from many different influences and do not necessarily signal sexual abuse, but they are among the warning signs to be on the watch for. You have already taken the first step toward preventing abuse just by watching this program and learning more about how sex offenders operate. I would also suggest that you regularly monitor the New York State Sex Offender Registry and sign up for the automatic alerts that will tip you off when a sex offender moves into your neighborhood. This is a good way, but not a foolproof way, to check up on the man who moved in across the street next door, the person you are considering as a babysitter, the volunteer coach or scout leader, and others who may have contact with your child. But a word of caution, We know that the vast majority of new sex offenses are being committed by someone who has not yet been convicted of a sex crime and is not yet in the registry. So this is a tool, a valuable tool, but only a tool. Nothing can take the place of parental vigilance. Thank you for watching and listening to what I know is a very disturbing program. I hope it has opened your eyes to the epidemic of child sexual abuse.